Dakota Territory, 1885. While neighbors rushed to build single-door cabins before winter hit, Norwegian immigrant Lars Nygaard was still framing something they'd never seen, a tiny room with two doors instead of one. His neighbors called it wasteful lumber. They called him a fool for wasting space on an entry that served no purpose. Every other homesteader built the standard way, 16 by 18-foot cabins with one thick door opening straight into the living space. But Lars built a 5 by 7-foot vestibule with an outer door and an inner door, spending 3 extra days and 60 board feet of lumber on what Henry Collier, the Civil War veteran, dismissed as a room just to enter. Then January arrived with a vengeance. Temperatures plunged to 20 below zero. Winds howled across the prairie at 40 miles per hour for weeks. Standard cabins struggled to hold 35 degrees inside. Water froze in buckets near the door. Children slept in coats. Families burned through half a cord of wood each week. But that fool's double-door cabin? It stayed a steady 50 degrees, 23 degrees warmer than his neighbors, burning only a third of the wood. What did Lars understand about heat, wind, and survival that every other settler missed? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. Comment your city and time. We love reading where these documentaries reach. The thermometer nailed beside Lars Nygaard's inner door read 46 degrees on a January night when the wind screamed across the Dakota prairie at 40 miles per hour. Outside, the mercury had dropped to 10 below zero, but inside his tiny entry room, 3 neighbors stood brushing snow from their coats, their breath visible in the dim lamplight. One of them, red-faced from the bitter cold, muttered through chattering teeth, "It's near freezing in our place. How in blazes is yours this warm?" Lars tapped the solid plank door behind him and said matter-of-factly, "2 doors hold more heat than one." What these men were witnessing was no accident. It was the result of a design that had kept Norwegian coastal farms warm for generations, adapted now to the brutal winds of the northern plains. 6 months earlier, when Lars had started building his cabin in late summer, his approach had drawn nothing but skepticism from the growing community of homesteaders scattered across the territory. While every other settler raced to throw up the quickest, cheapest shelter before winter arrived, Lars took his time with details that seemed pointless to his American-born neighbors. The standard frontier practice was simple and economical. Build a one-room box about 14 by 16 feet or 16 by 18 feet using 6 to 8-inch pine or cottonwood logs roughly chinked with mud and grass. A single door opened straight into the living space, sometimes with a canvas or quilt hung behind it as the only concession to drafts. The county agricultural agent's pamphlets and traveling advice promoted this approach. Build quick, don't waste lumber on non-essential rooms, get your family under a roof before the snow flies. Lars built differently. His main room followed a similar footprint, 16 by 18 feet with log walls, but attached to the south wall protected from the prevailing northwest winds, he framed something his neighbors had never seen, a vestibule measuring 5 by 7 feet with a 7-foot ceiling. The structure required both an outer door and an inner door, both made of solid planks an inch and 3/4 thick, fitted with simple wooden latches and thick braided rugs positioned as draft snakes at each threshold. The frame used leftover 2x4s and rough-sawn boards, topped with a slightly sloped roof covered in hand-split shingles. Inside the windowless space, he installed only the basics: a peg rail for coats, a simple shelf, and a plank floor raised a few inches above grade to stay dry. The extra work required 3 additional days of labor and the equivalent of 60 to 80 board feet of lumber plus a small pile of nails, materials his neighbors could easily calculate and scoff at. "Lars, you building a whole house just for your boots?" one man joked as he watched the Norwegian carefully hang the inner door. Another shook his head and pointed out, "Room like that could add another bed, you know." Henry Collier, the Civil War veteran who served as an informal authority among the homesteaders, was particularly vocal in his criticism. "A good tight door is all any man needs," he insisted, gesturing toward his own cabin, where a single heavy door opened directly into his stoveroom. "I built plenty of shelters in the war, and we never wasted time on fancy entrances." Lars tried to explain quietly what he knew from his childhood on a Norwegian coastal farm. When wind blows hard all winter, he told them, you never open straight into the heated space, you let the cold air hit a buffer first. He mentioned conversations with Ojibwe hunters who had shown him winter lodges with angled or tunnel-like entrances that forced wind to slow down and drop its snow before reaching the living area. This wasn't superstition, he explained, but practical knowledge tested by generations of people who understood how cold air moved and how heat escaped. His neighbors listened politely but remained unconvinced. They had their own tested methods from the Midwest and the settled East, and those methods emphasized speed and economy over refinement. As autumn progressed toward winter, the vestibule stood complete, plain, windowless, and wasteful in the eyes of everyone who saw it. The outer door faced south, positioned to catch whatever weak sun the winter months might offer, while the inner door opened into the main cabin where the stove would burn through the cold months ahead. The double door arrangement meant that anyone entering would have to open one door, step into the small intermediate space, close the first door, then open the second door to reach the living area. To his neighbors, this seemed like an unnecessary complication, especially when carrying armloads of firewood or hauling water in sub-zero temperatures. The mockery continued through the early winter months. When neighbors visited Lars's cabin for evening conversations or to borrow tools, they made jokes about his room to enter and predicted it would collect nothing but snow, mice, and extra cold air. One man suggested that the space would just become another place for heat to leak away, making the cabin harder to warm rather than easier. Another pointed out that the extra door meant more wood joints to come loose, more latches to freeze up, more surfaces where cold could seep through. But Lars had built according to principles he trusted, and as the first snows began to fall and the wind started its relentless winter howl across the prairie, he watched his thermometers and waited. The vestibule was ready for testing, its simple construction hiding a sophisticated understanding of how air moved, how heat escaped, and how a few extra board feet of lumber could mean the difference between comfort and misery when the real cold arrived. His neighbors would soon discover whether their confidence in single-door simplicity could withstand the brutal mathematics of a Dakota winter, or whether the Norwegians' wasted space would prove to be the wisest investment any of them had made. The first test of Lars's double-door system came during the early cold snaps of November, when temperatures dropped to 20 degrees and neighbors began their daily routines of hauling water, splitting wood, and tending livestock. In the standard single-door cabins scattered across the settlement, every opening of the entrance sent a visible blast of frigid air sweeping across the room. Children sitting near these doors complained of the cold drafts, and dishes would rattle on shelves from the sudden gust of wind that accompanied each entry. Women cooking near the door learned to step aside when their husbands came in from chores, knowing that a wall of cold air would follow them inside. Lars's cabin operated differently. When he opened his outer door to enter, the cold November air filled only the small vestibule, roughly 250 cubic feet of space compared to the main room's 2,000 cubic feet. By the time he opened the inner door, the air temperature in the entry had already begun to moderate, warmed slightly by its separation from the brutal outdoor wind. The difference was immediately noticeable to anyone who visited. Where neighbors' cabins experienced sharp, uncomfortable drafts with every door opening, Lars's main room remained relatively stable, protected by what amounted to an airlock between the heated living space and the unforgiving Dakota weather. Curious about the mechanism he had created, Lars hung 2 cheap wall thermometers in his cabin, one just inside the inner door and another over the main table where his family ate their meals. He began tracking how much the room temperature dropped during typical daily activities, comparing his observations with what he witnessed in neighbors' homes. In Henry Collier's cabin, a single door opening during the dinner hour could drop the temperature near the entrance by 5 to 10 degrees within minutes. The cold air, being denser than the warm air inside, would pour across the floor like water, forcing the family to huddle closer to the stove until the room gradually rewarmed. In contrast, Lars's main room temperature dropped only 1 to 2 degrees during the same kind of entry, and the cold air that did enter was already partially tempered by its brief stay in the vestibule. He began counting door openings during busy days, hauling water from the well, bringing in firewood, checking on livestock, emptying waste buckets, retrieving tools from the barn. A typical homestead family opened their door 30 to 40 times each day during the active winter months, and Lars quietly calculated what those repeated temperature drops meant over the course of a week, a month, or an entire winter season. The technical explanation was simple but profound. A one-room cabin with a single door functioned like a giant bellows every time someone entered or exited. Cold, dense air poured in at ground level, while warm air escaped through the opening at the top, creating a massive exchange of heated and unheated air. Lars's vestibule acted as a buffer zone where most of this air exchange occurred in the small entry space rather than in the main living area. The volume difference was crucial. Replacing 250 cubic feet of air with cold outdoor air was far less damaging to overall comfort than forcing the stove to reheat the majority of the main room's air supply with each entry. During these early winter weeks, neighbors began to admit that Lars's cabin felt less drafty when they visited for evening conversations or borrowed tools. The difference was subtle but undeniable. His main room maintained a more consistent temperature, and visitors didn't experience the sharp cold shock that accompanied entering most frontier cabins. However, most settlers attributed this improvement to what they considered Norwegian peculiarities. Scandinavians like cramped spaces, one neighbor suggested. They're used to overbuilding everything. Others dismissed the vestibule as an expensive solution to a problem that could be solved more simply. Just throw another stick on the fire, Henry Collier maintained. Extra wood costs less than extra lumber. This attitude reflected the broader frontier philosophy that favored quick, economical solutions over what appeared to be unnecessary refinements. Most homesteaders had moved west with limited resources and faced constant pressure to establish their claims, build their shelters, and prove up their land as quickly as possible. The idea of spending 3 extra days and 60 board feet of lumber on a room to enter seemed wasteful when families were struggling to complete their basic cabins before winter arrived in earnest. The vestibule represented a luxury that practical frontier families could not afford, or so they believed. As November turned to December, however, subtle signs began to suggest that the coming winter might test all their assumptions about adequate shelter. Reports from town mentioned unusually early freezes and heavy snow falling in the territories farther north. Traveling merchants spoke of bitter cold settling in earlier than normal, and the Ojibwe hunters who occasionally traded with the settlers seemed to be preparing their winter camps with unusual care, gathering extra materials and reinforcing their lodges against what they sensed would be a harsh season. Lars observed these signs and made his own preparations. He added another thick braided rug at the threshold of his inner door, creating an even tighter seal against drafts. He checked the wooden latches on both doors, making sure they would operate smoothly even when ice began to form around the frames. He positioned extra firewood in the vestibule, where it would be protected from snow but easily accessible during storms. His neighbors watched these activities with mild amusement, still convinced that he was overthinking problems that could be handled with common sense and adequate fuel supplies. The vestibule stood ready, its plain wooden walls and simple plank floor hiding the sophisticated understanding of thermodynamics that had guided its construction. Soon, the real winter would arrive to test whether Norwegian coastal wisdom could protect a Dakota homestead, or whether the American frontier approach of single doors and extra firewood would prove sufficient for whatever the northern plains could deliver. The hard winter announced itself on December 15th with a temperature drop that stunned even veteran plainsmen. Within 24 hours, the mercury plunged from a tolerable 15 degrees to 25 below zero, accompanied by winds that screamed across the prairie at 45 miles per hour. The combination created wind chills approaching 45 below, cold so severe that exposed skin would freeze in minutes, and metal tools became painful to touch even through thick gloves. Snow began falling in sheets, building drifts 3 to 5 feet high against the north walls of every cabin and barn in the settlement. In the standard single-door cabins, the brutal conditions immediately exposed the limitations of conventional frontier construction. Henry Collier's cabin, typical of the settlement's building practices, struggled to maintain 35 degrees inside despite his large No. 8 box stove burning continuously. Water buckets placed near his door froze solid overnight, even when positioned just 6 feet from the stove. Frost formed along interior nail heads and accumulated in visible lines where chinking had failed between the logs. His children slept fully clothed under multiple quilts, their breath creating small clouds in the frigid air above their beds. Every time Collier opened his door to bring in firewood or check on livestock, the heated air seemed to rush outside in a visible plume, while Arctic air poured across the floor like a dense fog. His wife and children learned to brace themselves when they heard his hand on the latch, knowing that a wave of bitter cold would sweep through the room before the door could be closed and latched again. "Close that door!" became a constant refrain in cabins across the settlement, shouted by family members who felt the immediate temperature drop that accompanied each entry. The fuel consumption during this cold snap shocked families who had thought their wood supplies adequate for the winter. Collier found himself burning through half a cord of wood each week just to maintain minimal comfort, far more than he had calculated when laying in his winter supply. Other families faced similar demands. Splitting and hauling wood became a daily emergency as stoves consumed fuel at unprecedented rates. The combination of extreme outdoor temperatures and massive heat loss through door openings created an energy drain that no one had anticipated. Lars's cabin told a different story entirely. His main room, heated by a stove identical in size to his neighbor's, maintained a steady 48 to 50 degrees, even during the worst of the cold snap. The thermometer near his inner door consistently showed temperatures 20 to 25 degrees warmer than comparable measurements in nearby cabins. More importantly, his fuel consumption remained manageable, roughly 1/3 less wood than his neighbors were burning to achieve far inferior comfort levels. The vestibule proved its worth during these brutal conditions in ways that surprised even Lars. Snow that accumulated against his outer door remained dry and powdery in the unheated entry space, making it easy to brush away rather than letting it melt into ice against the threshold. The small room provided a staging area where he could remove snow-crusted outer garments and stomp ice from his boots without introducing moisture into the main living space. When he opened the inner door, the air that entered the cabin had already been partially warmed by its brief stay in the protected vestibule. The human consequences of these temperature differences became visible within days. Mrs. Collier's youngest son developed a persistent cough after several nights sleeping near the drafty area by their single door, forcing the family to move his bed closer to the stove where space was already cramped. Other families reported similar problems: children unable to sleep because of cold drafts along the floor, women struggling to cook meals while battling constant gusts of frigid air every time their husbands entered the cabin. In contrast, Lars's family maintained their normal routines with minimal adjustment. His wife could work at her table in relative comfort, protected from the dramatic temperature swings that plagued other households. Their children slept soundly in beds that remained warm enough that extra clothing was unnecessary. The stability of temperature in their main room meant that daily activities, cooking, mending, reading, could continue without the constant interruption of cold shocks. As the severe weather stretched into its second week, with nighttime temperatures remaining below 20 degrees and daytime highs struggling to reach zero, the differences between cabin designs became impossible to ignore. Neighbors who had dismissed the vestibule as unnecessary Norwegian overbuilding began to pay attention to the practical results. When they visited Lars's cabin during evening social calls, visits that had become less frequent as travel became difficult, they immediately noticed the contrast in comfort levels. The social dynamics in the small settlement began to shift subtly. Conversations that had once focused on mocking Lars's wasted space now turned to discussions of fuel consumption and indoor temperatures. Families started comparing how much wood they were burning and sharing strategies for staying warm. The numbers were stark and undeniable. Cabins with single doors were consuming dramatically more fuel while providing significantly less comfort than Lars's double-door design. By mid-January, reports from town indicated that the cold snap was part of a larger weather pattern that might persist for weeks rather than days. The stagecoach driver spoke of similar conditions stretching across the northern territories, with some areas reporting temperatures below 30 degrees for extended periods. Several families quietly began to calculate whether their remaining wood supplies would last if they continued burning fuel at the current rate, and the mathematics were troubling. The vestibule had moved from being a curiosity to being a solution, though few neighbors were ready to admit the shift openly. But as January stretched toward February with no sign of warming, and as woodpiles throughout the settlement shrank at alarming rates, the little room that had once seemed wasteful began to look like the wisest construction decision anyone had made. By early February, the mathematics of survival had become brutally clear to every family in the settlement. Henry Collier, who had started the winter with what he considered an adequate supply of 4 cords of seasoned oak and cottonwood, found himself down to his final cord with 6 weeks of potential cold weather remaining. At his current consumption rate of half a cord per week during the severe stretches, he faced the terrifying prospect of running out of fuel before spring arrived. Other families found themselves in similar straits. The Hendersons had burned through 3 of their 4 cords. The Schmidts were splitting green wood in desperation, and the widow Peterson had already sent word to town asking relatives to bring additional fuel supplies. Lars, meanwhile, maintained his measured pace of wood consumption. Having started the season with 5 cords stacked neatly behind his cabin, he still retained nearly 3 cords despite the weeks of bitter cold. His daily fuel requirements remained consistent and manageable, burning roughly 2/3 of what his neighbors required to heat similar-sized living spaces. The difference was not marginal. It represented the boundary between adequate winter supplies and potential disaster. The cold had settled into a relentless pattern by this point, with nighttime temperatures regularly dropping to 25 and 30 below zero, and daytime highs struggling to reach 10 below. Winds continued to howl across the prairie at 30 to 40 miles per hour, creating conditions that made even brief trips to the barn or privy dangerous undertakings. Under these circumstances, the efficiency of each cabin's heating system became a matter of life and death rather than simple comfort. Charles Benton, the county agricultural agent who had begun documenting the settlement's adaptation to prairie conditions, made his rounds during a brief warming period in mid-February. His informal survey revealed stark differences in how families were coping with the extended cold. In the standard single-door cabins, he recorded interior temperatures ranging from 28 to 35 degrees during morning hours, even with stoves burning continuously. Families reported water freezing regularly in containers placed more than 8 feet from their heating sources, and several mentioned that bread dough would not rise properly due to the consistently cold conditions. At Lars's cabin, Benton's thermometer readings told a different story. The main room maintained temperatures between 45 and 50 degrees throughout the day, even during the coldest outdoor conditions. More significantly, the temperature remained stable rather than fluctuating wildly with each door opening. Benton noted in his records that Lars's family could perform normal household tasks, cooking, sewing, reading, without the constant struggle against cold that characterized other homesteads. The agent also documented something more troubling in his visits to neighboring cabins. The extreme fuel consumption required to maintain even minimal warmth was forcing families to make dangerous choices. Some had begun burning furniture, fence posts, and even structural timbers from their barns to supplement dwindling wood supplies. Others were rationing heat, allowing their cabins to cool during certain hours, and gambling that they could rekindle adequate warmth before anyone suffered frostbite or worse. On February 20th, during a particularly savage night when temperatures dropped to 32 below zero with winds gusting to 50 miles per hour, the theoretical advantages of Lars's vestibule became a practical matter of shelter for multiple families. The Colliers, whose cabin had become essentially uninhabitable, interior temperatures dropping to 25 degrees despite a roaring fire, made the decision to move their 3 children to Lars's cabin for the night. The Hendersons, facing similar conditions, brought their elderly father and youngest daughter. The movement of 10 additional people into Lars's cabin would have been disastrous for heat retention in a standard single-door design. Each entry and exit would have dumped the carefully accumulated warm air into the brutal night, forcing the stove to work even harder to maintain livable conditions. But the vestibule proved its worth as an airlock system during this crisis. Families could enter the outer door, remove their snow-covered outer garments in the protected space, and allow the cold air clinging to their bodies to moderate before opening the inner door to the heated living area. The entry also became a staging area for boots, coats, and other gear that would have created puddles of ice water if brought directly into the warm cabin. Children could change from outdoor clothing to indoor garments in the vestibule, preventing the moisture and cold associated with wet clothing from entering the main room. The system worked so efficiently that even with a dozen people coming and going for necessary trips outside, the main cabin maintained its temperature stability. During this crowded night, Lars took the opportunity to explain his design philosophy to Henry Collier, who had spent months mocking the double-door system. "You're heating the whole outdoors every time you open your door," Lars said simply as they sat by the stove. "I only heat this little room here first." He gestured toward the vestibule, where several coats hung on pegs and boots lined the raised plank floor. The explanation was practical rather than theoretical, a farmer's understanding of how air moved and heat escaped, developed through generations of coastal Norwegian winters. Collier, warm for the first time in weeks, examined the construction details of the inner door and its tight-fitting frame. He could see how the two-door system created what amounted to a buffer zone, preventing the massive air exchanges that plagued his own cabin. The mathematical reality was undeniable. Lars had cut his heat loss per entry by an estimated 50 to 70% through the simple expedient of creating a small intermediate space where cold air could be contained and gradually warmed before entering the main living area. As dawn broke over the snow-covered prairie, revealing drifts that had grown even higher during the night, families began preparing to return to their own cabins. But the experience had changed something fundamental in how the settlement viewed building practices. The vestibule was no longer an eccentric Norwegian oddity. It had become the difference between adequate shelter and potential disaster during the worst weather any of them had ever experienced. When the spring thaw finally arrived in late March, the evidence of the hard winter's toll was written plainly across the settlement's landscape. Scattered around nearly every cabin were the remnants of emergency fuel consumption, broken furniture, fence rails, even sections of barn siding that families had burned in their desperate attempts to maintain heat during the worst cold snaps. But behind Lars's cabin, his woodpile remained substantially intact, a visual testament to the efficiency of his double-door design that no amount of skepticism could explain away. Henry Collier, who had entered spring with less than half a cord of wood remaining, found himself studying that woodpile with the calculating eye of a man who had learned hard lessons about prairie winters. He approached Lars one morning in early April with a tape measure and a small notebook, asking detailed questions about the exact dimensions of the vestibule and the thickness of both doors. The conversation was awkward for both men. Collier had spent months ridiculing the very construction techniques he now wanted to understand and replicate. "I figure that little room of yours saved you near 2 cords of wood this winter," Collier admitted as he measured the 5 by 7 foot entry space. "Maybe more, considering how hard we had to burn just to keep from freezing." Lars nodded but offered no commentary on his neighbor's change of heart. The results spoke clearly enough without additional explanation. The vestibule had performed exactly as Norwegian building tradition had promised it would, creating a buffer zone that dramatically reduced heat loss during the countless door openings that winter survival demanded. Word of the fuel savings spread quickly through the scattered homesteads as families compared their winter experiences and calculated the costs of different building approaches. Jakob Schultz, the young German-Russian settler whose cabin had struggled to maintain adequate temperatures despite continuous firing of his stove, began planning modifications for the coming summer. He had watched his own fuel consumption carefully and estimated that a vestibule might have cut his wood requirements by a full cord, savings that represented weeks of labor in cutting, splitting, and hauling timber. By midsummer, the transformation of the settlement's building practices was well underway. 5 cabins were under construction or modification to include entry rooms, with dimensions ranging from Lars's 5 by 7 foot model to slightly larger versions that some families designed to accommodate additional storage or workspace. The Hendersons built a 6 by 8 foot vestibule with extra shelving for tools and outdoor gear. The Schmidts opted for a more modest 4 by 6 foot entry, but added a small window to provide natural light during daily activities. Charles Benton, the county agricultural agent, documented this shift in his official reports to the territorial government. His summer survey revealed that 7 of the settlement's 10 cabins now featured some form of double-door entry system, representing a complete reversal from the previous year when only Lars had employed the design. The adoption rate was unprecedented for any building innovation Benton had observed during his years of documenting frontier construction practices. The agent's notes also recorded conversations with settlers about the reasoning behind their modifications. Most families cited fuel economy as their primary motivation, but they also mentioned improved comfort levels and reduced drafts as significant benefits. Several women specifically commented on their ability to cook and work without battling constant cold air infiltration, while parents noted that children could sleep more comfortably in areas that had previously been too cold for use during severe weather. As Benton compiled his observations, he began to recognize connections between Lars's vestibule design and building practices he had encountered in other cold climates. Norwegian immigrants throughout the Northern Territories employed similar entry rooms, which they called vindfang, wind catchers, designed specifically to break the force of cold air before it reached heated living spaces. He also noted parallels with indigenous construction techniques, particularly the low, sheltered entrances used in earth lodges and winter habitations that forced cold air to settle and warm before entering main chambers. These connections highlighted a broader pattern that Benton found significant enough to include in his territorial reports. Traditional building knowledge from multiple cultures had developed similar solutions to the problem of heat retention in extreme cold, yet American frontier construction practices had largely ignored these proven techniques in favor of speed and economy. The result had been cabins that were adequate for moderate climates, but dangerously inefficient when subjected to the severe conditions that characterized Northern Plains winters. The following winter provided additional validation of the vestibule concept, though the test was less severe than the previous year's brutal conditions. Families with new entry rooms reported fuel savings of 20 to 30% compared to their previous winter's consumption, even accounting for the milder temperatures. More importantly, they maintained more consistent interior temperatures and experienced fewer of the comfort problems that had plagued them during their first Plains winter. By the settlement's third year, the double-door entry had become standard practice for new construction. Visitors from other territories often commented on the unusual prevalence of entry rooms in what had begun as a typical frontier community. When asked about the design choice, settlers would inevitably point toward Lars's cabin and explain the practical benefits they had witnessed during the hard winter that had tested every family's survival strategies. The transformation represented more than a simple adoption of Norwegian building techniques. It demonstrated how environmental pressure could force rapid adaptation of traditional knowledge that had been initially dismissed as foreign or unnecessary. The vestibule had proven that frontier pragmatism, when properly informed by tested methods from other cultures and climates, could produce innovations that improve both survival odds and daily comfort for families struggling to establish themselves on the challenging northern plains. In his final report on the settlement, Benton wrote that the community had developed what he considered a superior cold climate building standard through the integration of Scandinavian techniques with American frontier construction methods. The result was cabins that used substantially less fuel while providing significantly better protection against extreme weather, a combination that he recommended for adoption throughout the Northern Territories where similar conditions prevailed.